Welcome, everybody. Happy Halloween. It is the Thursday before Election Day, and we have a whole lot of early vote data to get to. Uh, that being said, before we start, I do just want to introduce myself to those of you who don't know me. I'm Nathaniel Stinnett, and I am the executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. For those of you who aren't familiar with our nonprofit, we work in 19 states with over 7,000 volunteers to identify and then mobilize low propensity climate voters. If you're not familiar with that term of art, these are people who are likely to list climate and other environmental issues as their number one priority, yet they are unlikely to vote. And there are millions of them. We're literally targeting 4.8 million of them in those 19 states this fall. This is a huge opportunity for the environmental movement to build our political power. That is all I'm going to say about the Environmental Voter Project in this webinar, though. So if you would like to learn more about our work, please go to one of the links that's going to be shared in the chat where you can learn more about our results and how we do what we do and how you can get involved. Today is going to be a deep dive into what we're seeing in early vote data and some analysis of that data. So without further ado, let's get into things. I know this chart might hurt some of your eyes. For those of you who were with us 3 days ago in our first briefing, you're used to seeing this. What this is a comparison between all registered voters in each state and what their early vote turnout is, and early vote turnout among the people we've identified as likely to list climate as their top priority. Now, again, I don't expect you to squint and see all the details in every state. I think the next slide is going to be a little bit clearer. But first, just while we're on this slide, to give you some context, let me point out a few important things that we're seeing in our data. First, Pennsylvania continues to be a state where when you look at people who have already cast their ballots, and to be clear, for those of you who aren't aware of this, it is public record whether you vote or not. And during early vote windows, we have twice daily updates showing us which individual voters have already cast their ballots. So we're able to have almost real-time tracking of data like this. First thing you can see is people who are likely to list climate as a top priority are significantly outvoting the underlying baseline of registered voters in Pennsylvania, maybe the single most important swing state. You'll also see that's happening pretty dramatically in Nebraska. Why do I highlight Nebraska? It is a close US Senate race. Maybe not the closest, but it could be. It is a very, very close US Senate race. I also highlight Georgia. In Georgia, climate voters are undervoting the baseline of registered voters in the state. But don't get too upset about that because I've got some more data for you that might be able to clear things up a little bit. But these are three sort of broad takeaways. Okay, I promised you that the next slide would show this data in a slightly clearer way. I still think it's important to get the context of looking at it like this. But here, this shows the net data. So, for instance, the way to read this is in Alaska, climate voters are outvoting the overall electorate by 3.2 percentage points. Arizona, they're outvoting by 3.5 percentage points. So here you can see out of the 19 states where the Environmental Voter Project works, in 14 of them, climate voters are outvoting the underlying baseline of registered voters. And in some states, really pretty significantly. Again, I highlight Pennsylvania, Nebraska, Iowa. But look, there are also states where they're undervoting the baseline. As I pointed out before, Georgia. I was looking at this data this morning, getting ready for this presentation, and I thought, it's weird. What do those 5 states have in common? And after a few minutes, it hit me. Pretty dramatic, right? They're the Deep South. There are obviously a bunch of variables that could go into seeing results like this. But certainly the first thing that comes to mind, I don't know if it is what is driving these results, but the first thing that comes to mind is in all of our data, we see that these people who are likely to list climate as their top priority are not just disproportionately young, they are also disproportionately people of color, and in particular, Black voters. And I know you don't need me to tell you that all of these states have a real history and an ongoing perception of voter suppression. And we've done some polling. There's a lot of other data out there showing that not only is it often harder for people of color, in particular Black people, to vote in these states, but even beyond that, there is this perception, this understood idea among Black Georgians and Black Texans and Black North Carolinians that it is harder to vote. I don't think that's the only thing that's going on here, but it was pretty shocking once we realized what those 5 states had in common. So I did want to highlight that for you. All right. One thing that is really important, and I should have said this at the beginning, is to understand that although now over 53 million Americans have voted, and we've got a really rich data set of early voting, although that's really interesting to dig into, early vote data is not predictive of eventual results. And one of the biggest reasons it is not predictive of eventual results is it is so hard to tease out how many of these early voters represent a real new advantage for a particular party or a particular candidate or a particular issue constituency, and how many of them are just people who otherwise would have voted anyway. Maybe they're people who in the past voted on Tuesday and now they just vote on Thursday. So what I really, really like to do is not just look at turnout of all early voters, but instead focus on turnout of first-time voters. Because those are people who we are pretty confident wouldn't have otherwise just shown up, because they don't have a history of doing that. And so this is a slightly better way of reading into early vote data to figure out, is anything interesting going on here? Because at the very least, these are people who don't have a history of always voting. So when we look at that, when we look at first-time or potential first-time voters, the data is a little bit different. Again, we're comparing all registered voters to climate voters, but what's different about this chart and the next one is now we're just looking at potential first-time voters, people who have never voted before. Again, in Pennsylvania, potential first-time climate voters are voting at a significantly higher rate than the baseline electorate of potential first-time voters. Also in Nebraska. Oh, but look at Georgia. It flipped. It flipped. So remember that previous chart where many of you probably thought, oh my gosh, wow, climate voters are barely voting at all compared to all early voters, and you are right. But what this data tells us is that much of that was probably just due to a whole bunch of people who typically vote anyway, simply deciding to vote at a different point in time than they normally do. Now, that's still an advantage, right? You always want to bank your votes early, or a disadvantage for the climate movement. But look, what's interesting about this is if you isolate people who have never voted before, first-time climate voters are early voting at a higher rate than the overall electorate of potential first-time voters in Georgia. We can also see that it flipped in Texas pretty darn dramatically. And look at Nevada as well. Now to look at that net chart that we saw before, you'll see Texas and Georgia have flipped pretty dramatically. Whereas if you looked at all registered voters, of all vote histories and propensities, the climate movement was undervoting the overall electorate in those states. But now when you just isolate potential first-time voters to get rid of all those people who are probably going to vote anyway, it's a lot better news for the climate movement, except in those states that are still orange. And some of them, let's admit, are important states. Look at North Carolina. Look at Iowa. Iowa's an important state. 2 out of their 4 congressional seats are toss-ups. All right. When we look at all of the 4.8 million potential first-time climate voters that we're targeting at the Environmental Voter Project, so let me say that again. I know it was a mouthful. We are targeting 4.8 million registered voters across 19 states, all of whom are highly likely to list climate as their top priority, yet they are unlikely to vote this fall without being nudged to do so. And how do we know that? Well, we looked at their public voting histories, and they don't vote. Well, as of this morning, 335,508 of them had already cast ballots. Those are all first-time voters who list climate as a top priority. And because they're first-time voters, it means many, not all, but many of them are not showing up in likely voter polls. They're at least not showing up in polls of likely voters where what determines a likely voter is someone's previous voting history, which is often the likely voter screen in a lot of polls. When we look at the state-by-state breakdown of all of those 335,000, you'll see we've got some huge numbers in some really important states. 45,000 first-time climate voters in Georgia, 7,700 in Nevada, almost 10,000 in Pennsylvania, almost 30,000 in North Carolina. Now, I want to be clear. Different states are at different points in their early voting windows. And so some of these numbers look bigger or smaller than they should in relation to the size of that state's population. And that's why. Also, different states have different laws about early voting. Early voting is a hell of a lot easier in a place like Nevada, where every active voter gets mailed a ballot and it's really easy to vote early in person, than it is in Pennsylvania, where in many counties there is only one place per county where you can go and vote early in person. So don't read too much in the differences between states here, but the raw numbers I think are pretty darn impressive. And for all of the volunteers and donors to the Environmental Voter Project who are on the call, I hope you feel really, really good about this. We've got a whole lot more work to do, but the fact that we have already banked, what was the number again? 335,000 first-time climate voters who we're targeting is great news, because now we're not sending digital ads or making phone calls or door knocks to 4.8 million. Now we're only targeting a little more than 4.4 million, and hopefully we're going to get that down much, much closer to 4 by the time we get to Election Day. And none of these people were supposed to show up. They've never voted before. All right, now I want to drill down into some state-specific analysis. First, Arizona, and I'm not going to go into all 19 states. We picked some battleground states and some states that are important for Senate elections. In Arizona, you can see what happened in 2020. So far in 2024, you can see almost 1.7 million ballots have been cast. Almost 14,000 of our targets have voted. When you look at polling averages from places like 538.com or Real Clear Politics, you can see that it's within the margin of error, but Trump is a little bit ahead, but still within the margin of error. One data point that really continues to pop out to me, though, is when you look at first-time voters. So when you look at first-time voters and then look at their modeled party affiliation, I use air quotes for modeled because this is not how people register, but it is how people register and data scientists' best guess about which way they will vote. It is a predictive model that's built to try to determine how people are likely to vote, Democrat or Republican. Well, at this point in time, 5 days before Election Day in 2020, if you looked at all early voters in Arizona, Democrats had, or modeled Democrats had a 1.8 percentage point advantage. Currently, they have a 10.8 percentage point advantage. Now, again, don't read too much into this. This is just first-time voters, which is a very small subset of early voters, which in itself is a small subset of the eventual electorate. But I'll reiterate, what I like about looking at first-time voters is that it weeds out all of those early votes who were going to show up anyway. And so if we're going to tease out anything interesting from early vote data, I always feel like looking at first-time voters gives us something extra. All right, in Georgia, 5 million ballots were cast back in 2020. And remember, there were the Senate races and everything. I mean, Georgia was the center of the world. Yet, oh my gosh, like over 60% of that has already been cast in early ballots, in early vote ballots. I mean, early vote turnout is just absurdly high in Georgia so far. You can see almost 10% of our targets have voted. You can see how close it is in the polling averages. And some data that's really popping out to me. Again, I'm just looking at first-time voters. First is the growth in the gender gap. I use the term gender gap. Voter files have sex data rather than gender data for a bunch of reasons, which I imagine you can figure out. But just know that when I say gender gap, I'm using that term of art. It actually means sex gap. Women were outvoting, first-time voter women were outvoting first-time voter men in 2020 by almost 3 percentage points in Georgia. Now it's almost 7 percentage points. However, cutting against that is Republicans are looking pretty darn strong with early vote turnout in Georgia. In 2020, modeled Republicans among first-time early voters had an almost 4 percentage point advantage. Now it's still a little bit over 2. Republicans are doing very, very well in early vote turnout in Georgia. And you can see that when you're looking at these first-time voters. All right, Nebraska. Remember, I bring up Nebraska because the Fisher-Osborne race. Fisher is the incumbent Republican. Osborne is an independent running for one of the 2 U.S. Senate races because there's a special that are up this year. It's a very close race. Fisher is pretty consistently trending ahead now that there's a decent number of independent polls, but it's still pretty darn close. And the data point that really pops out to me is that, oh my gosh, are people who are likely to vote Democratic in Nebraska just killing it in early voting. Now, again, what we're looking at here are just first-time voters to try to weed out what I've now mentioned multiple times. So this is good news for the Osborne campaign. But let's be very clear here. When we talk about the number of first-time early votes cast, I believe we're talking about 2,500, maybe 3,000 early votes. This is a really small subset of a subset of a subset. So just, my guess is Nebraska is going to stay a red state, but boy, is there some good news at least to see for Democrats in the early vote data. Okay, Nevada. Here's another thing where I'm going to push against a lot of the conventional reporting that's been going on. There's been a whole lot of reporting going on about how Republicans are killing it in the early vote returns in Nevada. Well, yeah, when you look at all early votes, modeled Republicans have a 4.0 percentage point advantage. But when you look at first-time voters, Democrats have a 2-point advantage. My guess is a lot of what is going on here is there's still an enormous batch of mail ballots in Clark County, which is where Las Vegas is, that haven't been tallied yet. But if you've seen a lot of reporting about how Republicans are just killing it in early voting in Nevada, that I think is missing this very important variable that you can see in the voter file, that a lot of those Republican votes are coming from people who have always voted. They just used to do it on election day, and now they're voting before election day. Whereas if you look at the people who have never voted before, there's a Democratic advantage, and there's reason to believe there's going to be an even bigger Democratic advantage by the time election day rolls around because of all of those yet to be tallied mail ballots in Clark County. North Carolina, even more than Georgia, North Carolina has just been early voting at an astoundingly high rate. I mean, look at that. Look at that. It's huge. Very, very close looking race. This is something where, when we look at the early vote data, though, similar to Georgia again, Republicans are doing pretty darn well. Republicans are doing pretty darn well in early vote data. And you can see there's actually almost no difference between when you look at all early voters or just to isolate the first-time voters. Even among first-time voters, Republicans do have an advantage in early vote turnout. There are a lot of latent Democratic votes sitting on the sidelines in North Carolina. All right, Pennsylvania, the swing state to end all swing states. There has not been that much early voting in Pennsylvania. Those of you who are familiar with how voting laws have progressed over time in Pennsylvania know that it's only been recently that early voting has been allowed in Pennsylvania. And even then, as I alluded to earlier, it's kind of a weird type of early voting where in many counties, there's really just one place at the county elections office, which could be 45 minutes away from where you live, where you can vote early. And so that's why we've only seen about 1.4 million ballots cast so far. One thing that we continue to see, if you were at our first early vote briefing a few days ago, I highlighted this. We continue to see that there are a lot of urban voters who are not early voting, at least not early voting at the same share of the electorate that they were this time 4 years ago. That tells me that late GOTV efforts in Philly and Pittsburgh continue to be extraordinarily important in Pennsylvania. All right, finally, Texas. Another close US Senate race there. Ted Cruz is now a little bit beyond the margin of error in the polling averages. Another thing to tease out there, oh, I'm sorry that it went below that box there, is it's kind of hard to read. This is my fault. Sorry about that. What you can see is that if you look at all first-time voters in 2020, Republicans had a 10-point advantage. Now they have almost a 16-point advantage. But a lot of that comes from the fact that you can't vote early in Texas unless, I'm sorry, you can't vote by mail in Texas unless you're 65 years or older, or you treat it like an absentee ballot and sign an affidavit saying that you are not going to be in the state. And so a lot of the Republican advantage, the huge Republican advantage in early voting data that we're seeing, comes just from those mail ballots. Because if instead you look at really young voters, you can see that that Republican advantage almost completely disappears from where it was 4 years ago. And again, I'm sorry about the format on that. This is what you get when you put together your own slides. All right. If you want to help us continue to boost turnout among climate voters, and in particular first-time climate voters, over the final few days before the election, we are trying to recruit to fill 4,825 phone banking shifts. And as you can see, it starts tomorrow. Tomorrow. You'll find a link in the chat where you can sign up for these phone banks. They are proven to work. We know they will increase turnout. And just tomorrow alone, we need to fill 600 two-hour shifts. Over the weekend, we're looking to fill 1,675 shifts. Sign up for a shift. You'll get trained. You'll be given a proven script. You'll reach out to these non-voting environmentalists we've identified, 335,000 of whom we've already gotten to vote. Believe me, it works and we can use it. Okay. Finally, if you want to make a donation, there is also a link in the chat. Yes, we can still use donations. We're still topping off our digital ad buys in places where we can still find really cheap digital ad inventory. All right. I think we have left time for a few questions. All of us only budgeted about 30, 35 minutes for this call, so we're only going to take a few questions. But Peter, what do we got?
Great, thank you. So Rose, great name, Rose, asked real early on about the efficiency versus efficacy of text banking compared to canvassing and phone banking. And there have been other questions that more generally, are asking about what should we do? Where should we do it? What's the most impactful way to create a positive change here in the next few days before polls close on Tuesday?
Really, really great question, Rose. So first, let me address texting, and then I'll address all of the methods of voter turnout contact. On texting, uh, due to some rules that were passed a few years ago by mobile phone carriers, uh, it is no longer permissible for campaigns to text people who have not opted into receiving those texts. Now, I'm sure some of you are saying, are you kidding me? Because your phone probably blows up as much as mine does. A lot of those are campaigns who have bought lists. And so they say, oh, well, they opted into that list, so we can do them too. But because of that, mobile phone carriers are blocking an absurdly high rate of texts that are sent directly to voters off of voter files. In some places, as much as 60 or 70% of texts. So I could give you data from 2, 3 years ago before these rules were in place. But the truth is now, although texting is very efficient, and we at the Environmental Voter Project were happy to do it 2 and 3 years ago before these rules went into place. Now, most of these texts are being blocked. And so the truth is they're not terribly efficient or effective anymore. All right. Other methods of contact. As Rose alluded to in her question, we look at it on two variables, efficiency and effectiveness. What do those mean? Well, effectiveness is how much can a particular form of voter contact boost turnout per contact made? How effective is it? By efficiency, we mean, okay, well, when you get that boost in turnout, well, how expensive is it per vote added? Or how much volunteer time does it take per vote added? Okay, let's take effectiveness. The single most effective way to increase turnout is still one human being talking to another human being at their door. Door-to-door canvassing is the single most effective way of voter turnout. After that, it's direct mail, digital ads, then phone calls, tied with volunteer postcards, and then texting. But there have been randomized control trials showing that if the messaging is right, all of those can increase turnout. Okay, but now let's talk about efficiency. Door-to-door canvassing is not terribly efficient. Even if you are doing it on like a Tuesday evening when everybody is home, maybe best case scenario in 2 hours, you can reach 15 people, 10 of whom are the people you're actually looking for. That's not a great contact rate. Whereas on a 2 hour phone bank, you might be able to talk to 60 or 70 people. Now, you might not have full conversations with them, as we all know, although you don't always have that on the doors either. So phone banking is actually the most efficient at the moment. Finally, just to get into the second part of the question that Peter put there, I should say, you know, the window of opportunity is closing. At this point in the election cycle, any campaign's most precious commodity is time. And so the window of opportunity to reach voters is closing. Nobody can send mail anymore. Most volunteers are going to reach very, very few people at the doors. And so phone calls have rapidly become much more valuable an intervention than, say, they were in August or September. And the final thing I should say about phone calls is, at least with the scripts that we use, we have randomized control trials proving that they work, proving that they increase turnout over control groups. All right, Peter, do we have time?
Well, Nathaniel, I did it. I muted you instead of unmuting myself. So it's a good thing
No
I'm
worries.
here. Really,
We have time for one more question.
I think we do. Yeah. So and thank you, Rose. Natalie asked a question about messaging. So when you were talking about the Southeast states, Natalie pointed out that, or asked, is there any way to message on some of the climactic issues that have been happening here? And I here meaning North Carolina, where I live. Another person asked a little bit ago, and I'm not finding this question right now, but what sort of messaging does EVP actually use when we're communicating with voters, and why do we use that?
Really, really great question. So I'm going to sort of combine the two. Natalie, you bring up a really good point, but the unfortunate truth is that as much as we would all like to think that rational messages designed around particular impacts or problems that people are having as a way to get them to vote, as much as we like to think that that would work, it doesn't. It doesn't. Now, I want to be clear. We're talking about a very specific type of messaging, which is behavior change messaging, trying to turn non-voters into new voters. If instead we were doing persuasion messaging, if we were trying to convince people who don't care about climate change to start caring about it, what you alluded to would absolutely be best practice. But to get to the second part of this question, what we have found works best across all states, including southeastern states, is not to try to rationally convince people of the value of their one vote over a denominator of millions. It's instead to treat people as social animals. And so, Peter, maybe you can share in the chat some links to some of the mini briefings we've had about the behavioral science behind our calling scripts. We have a very short video, I think it's about 10 minutes, that lays out precisely what is in our calling script. And it's very, very simple, but there's a lot of sophisticated behavioral science underneath it. And we've run out of time, so I won't get into a lot of detail here. But Natalie, and to the others who asked this question, very briefly, what we have found works best across all demographic groups is, one, to try to equate the act of voting with being a particular type of person that might be attractive to our voter targets. So what do I mean by that? Do they like to think that they're honest, trustworthy people? Well, okay, then what we're going to do in our canvassing or our calling script is we're going to ask people if they intend to vote. Most of them will be embarrassed and they'll say yes, and then we'll use that against them. We'll follow up with them right before the election and say, hey, just want to remind you, back on Friday, you said that you were going to vote, and Tuesday's your opportunity to follow through on that promise. These little social nudges like that. We also tweak the what's called choice architecture of our script. So we don't ask people, hey, are you going to vote? No, that makes it too easy for them to say no. Instead, we ask people, hey, Natalie, this is Nathaniel from the Environmental Voter Project. Do you intend to vote early in person, by mail, or on election day? That's what behavioral scientists call good choice architecture. Because I didn't even give you the option to say, no, I'm not voting. It pushes you towards what we want you to say and what societal norms tell you you ought to say, so that we can then take advantage of that. But I don't want to blithely set aside the underlying worry that you were trying to address there, Natalie, which is that not among first-time climate voters who we're targeting, but among all climate voters, we are seeing lower turnout in those southeastern states. Something is absolutely going on there. But among our target voters, remember, we're not seeing that. In fact, in places like Georgia and Texas, They have some of the highest turnout differences, positive turnout differences among our targets. All right, we went 5 minutes over. We told you all that this would only be 30 minutes. Thank you for joining us. I just want to close by saying, please take a moment to go into the chat right now and click that last link that was put there and sign up for one of these phone banking shifts. We're trying to fill 4,825 phone banking shifts. We're using proven scripts that work. You will be trained. Your phone number will not show up. It'll be our phone number that shows up. You've all outed yourselves, right? You're here because you want to make a difference. Well, now we're giving you the opportunity to make a difference. So please click on that link, sign up. Thank you to all of you, our volunteers and donors who are helping to make these great results happen. Thank you to Peter for all of your help. And I hope to see you all on a phone bank starting tomorrow. Bye-bye.